There we go. Take it
Oh,
away.
hi, everybody. I'm Adam Eason. Thanks for stopping by. Um, Tonight, I'm going to talk about some different scales that you might be interested in using to generate music. So, to start off with, as an introduction, um, these are all scales that have been cataloged by uh, Dr. Alex LaFollett over there. And I think this was your actual dissertation involved this, did it not? Or was this a side project? Oh, I'm sorry, you're still trying to figure out your muting thing, but he can type in chat his reply. Um, but we met at the, it's a mouthful, Organ Bach Festival Composer Symposium a few years back down in Salem. And I learned he lived kind of close by. So we got to talking a little bit, and he introduced me to his heptatonic modal catalog. And I'm kind of a little bit of a nerd myself, so I was like, okay, cool, this sounds awesome. I'd like to check it out and see what it's like. And this is what he sent me. So this is page one. And then I was like, oh no. Oh no. So it's 13 pages of a variety of different modes. I'm pretty sure it's every possible combination of whole, half, or half whole, augmented, doubly augmented, triply augmented, and even on the very last line, quadruply augmented, I think is the Q type um, that he has down here at the bottom steps. Okay. So when I first got this, I was just like, well, what do I even do? Where do I start? Because it's a pretty overwhelming amount of information to try and process. And I started by like trying to figure out what would be most immediately relevant to me as a composer. And it began with like trying to understand how he grouped these. So at the top, I'll kind of zoom in a little bit. We've got the 7 modes that everybody, I'm sure, knows and loves. Right? Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, and then over to Ionian, our major scale. And the way he grouped these, when we went over them together and I did some reading on my own, was by the most relevant kind of interval type. So in this top group, he has its only whole and half steps and different arrangements of those whole and half steps. And then in the next group, the A type, it has an augmented step in there somewhere. And then he has subtypes by, in this case, the order of steps around that augmented step. And then all of them are organized similarly. And that started to kind of help at least break down these big groups, but it was still a lot. My next step, I kind of played around with just, well, what can I do harmonically with some of these? And I would just pick them at random, just literally like roll a random number generator, and I would get, all right, I got 347, Amiclian, show me what you got. And I would do things like stack thirds, stack fourths. I tried to do counterpoint exercises with them, which got very strange very quickly because a lot of the rules of counterpoint are built on this assumption that we only have whole and half steps. And one of the things that I started finding was you'd have certain steps which would be consonant in a major scale between, let's say, 1 and 3. But especially as you move down and get to these triply augmented, doubly augmented steps, some of the adjacent or some of the thirds would actually be like sound as a second. And so that took some getting used to. I think in particular, as I did these counterpoint exercises, I made the realization that if I wanted to use these, I basically had to accept each mode on their own terms and just allow them to be, okay, this is how they arrange themselves. And let's just see what we can make out of them. So let me switch over to a different screen and cut down from, I forget exactly how many, 460 some odd, down to just one. So this is like a microcosm of some of that experimentation that I did. I would just write out the mode itself. In this case, this is the Limnian mode. So the steps would be starting from D in this case, whole step, another whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. And I would just play around on the scale and just sort of noodle around on the scale. And so you can hear what the scale sounds like. Here is what it is. Okay, so a nice little scale. I think this one has a number of other names. There are a couple, I think Dr. LaFollett mentioned had like, 5 or 6 different names depending on which theorist was talking about it. But as you'll hear when we get into these chords built in thirds, some of the assumptions about what we think of as a triad are going to be a little bit different. So here we go. Okay. In particular, I was finding in that very top group, once you got a couple of lines down, augmented triads were very common. They start popping up just as a matter of course. And then this crunchy little guy, the I guess major diminished fifth or flat fifth, showed up a fair amount as well, just as a particular sound. And this, because the final note, depending on your final note, right, this kind of messes around with what our ears naturally expect as tendency tones. Okay, so if we have the major scale, da, 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 right, that T up to do or fa down to mi, you start to find those tendency tones either, one, appear in different places and maybe unexpected places, or two, they're not as relevant, especially as you go farther and farther down into the list. They get more and more far removed from your major, minor, Dorian, Phrygian kind of scales, and you end up with some very different kind of feelings of either being drawn to different parts of the scale, or some scales don't really have a feeling of tendency. They're almost more like an octatonic or a whole tone scale in some points. So that was another thing to start getting used to orally, was, all right, they kind of only resemble these more familiar modes kind of superficially. Once you get into how they actually behave, it gets very lumpy, I think is a good way to put it, compared to where most of us have started with major and minor is just, you know, everywhere you turn on the radio and there it is. You won't hear D limnian really. So these are going to sound kind of a little bit farther out. When it, oh yes, Lisa, or Dr. Neer.
You can call me Lisa, it's all good. That's so sweet of you. Yeah, I was just curious, when you say behave, do you mean following the chord, like are you trying to use chords built on 1 through 7th scale degree in the order they would be seen in tonal music?
Okay, yeah, that's an excellent.
Or do you mean like something else? Because I think like since you mean these are your creations, so I'd be curious to know more about that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that was actually the first place I started, was let's just assume all of the rules and expectations of tonality are in place. You have a dominant, you have a tonic, some kind of subdominant, right? So, you know, 4-5-1, F major, G major, C major for your regular kind of more familiar places, pieces. So I took that as a starting place, and I took as a compositional model, sorry, I'm having to click through some buttons, Scarlatti. So I chose Scarlatti at the time because for some reason I was just listening. Somebody came in with, maybe is unmuted.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, there we go, no problem. So I was listening to a lot of Scarlatti, so I was like, okay, why not? It has the advantage that it's a very, he tends to write in fairly thin textures, right? 2 voices, 3 voices maybe. And I was already very familiar with, you know, classical music through Southern Methodist University and going through the music program there. Here is the very first thing I wrote. It uses that D limnian scale. Everything in this first little sonata comes from the D limnian scale with the exception of 1 chord. And I think you'll actually probably be able to hear it. I think that borrowed chord is fairly audible when it pops out. When I guess I'll start by just playing it, and then we'll talk about some of what I was thinking about for constructing it. it is, just a little kind of minuet little thing. When I wrote this, I said, okay, I'm going to assume the rules of traditional tonality are in place, but I ended up not following very closely to that. This little F sharp major chord ended up being a little bit more of a natural stopping place for me for some reason in this one, as opposed to the 5, which would have been an A minor chord. And I don't know, when I was following these little lines, they didn't seem to kind of naturally fall into circle of fifth type progressions. Now that could be just because of how I wrote it, but I think part of it is also because, again, of this, how do the notes actually behave when you get into it sort of situation. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit to show you one of the weird things, because there's that sort of disparity between what is actually the scale and what we hear as steps, right? In the scale right here, the descending scale from B flat, A, G sharp, F sharp. That's how it is in the actual scale. But B flat and G sharp are also technically, our ears hear just a whole step apart. So in this situation over here, the A is not present, but we still hear this whole step up, whole step down, whole step down, whole step up, whole step up. It sounds still like something drawn from its own major scale, right? Even though the context around it is different. And this kind of thing happens a lot, where you get these like little clusters of areas where it almost feels like, as you start playing around with the notes, it almost feels like you get kind of double vision, where it's like, well, there's a couple of scales that are sort of maybe overlapping according to our ears again. But otherwise, I was mostly just kind of following, you know, typical voice leading, like this A going up to B flat, kind of moving by step and keeping chords kind of moving close together. You can see similar things down here, where we're moving through different sequences. And again, the nature of these scales kind of allow you to really play around with the, I guess you could call it a certain ambiguity, depending on how you look at it, that happens with these scales. There are a lot of different options to approach building chords. So this is my first step. As I said, there's only one borrowed chord, this D flat 9, that shows up kind of at the end of the B section. But moving forward into another sonata, I've got 4 of them total. I wanted to play around with more possibilities. In particular, I wanted to look at how it sounds to have runs of scales over chords, or at least thirds. I wanted to introduce chromatic non-chord tones and start bringing these in, because I was like, you know, it's still a 7-note scale. So there's no reason why you couldn't have chromatic non-chord tones. And I wanted to see if it was either too distracting or you just wouldn't notice them. And I also wanted to start leaning into more borrowed chords, which you'll hear down in this section. I'm actually going to switch to a different view real quick so that everything can be on the page. And you can see, there we go. Maybe it's a little messier, maybe not. I'm going to give fair warning, this hasn't passed the live performer smell test. If I gave this to an actual keyboardist, there might very well be things where they'd kind of be like, let's change this. And I totally would, but I haven't had the opportunity yet. So this is what we've got. This actually uses the exact same scale, but centered on G instead of D. Okay. Thank you. So I'm gonna actually scooch over to this little sequence that happens here. And this was a really good, or this is really instructional to what I was saying about as I was working with counterpoint, odd things begin happening according to, if you follow the scale, according to the traditional rules of counterpoint. That this, if I were to take this exact same sort of idea that starts right around in here and use, it was this kind of sequence of steps in a major scale, right? We would have one thing, but it behaves in a very different way when the steps end up being in like little clumps, have a couple of half steps next to each other. So as an example, in a kind of major scale or minor scale, that C sharp would instead be a C natural, right? And you would end up with a more, slightly more familiar tone. Let me change those back. Right? Still, the voicing of what I'm using is still a little bit off from kind of a major mode, but that would be more closely aligned to our Baroque sequence as opposed to what we've got, right? Where these notes, the E flat, D, and C sharp, just kind of crunch together. And I was just kind of like, okay, that's what they do. That's how I approached this situation. I'm going to double check my notes real quick. If there's anything else that I wanted to talk about here. I did try using the borrowed chord idea. That happens a lot where you have like a major chord followed by the same root, but a minor chord, minor version of that root. And it turns out it works pretty well. right? The same basic idea, but altering some of the chord tones chromatically to create this little color change. I'm sure from the theorist's point of view, trying to figure out like where this chord is borrowed from might be tricky, but I'm not worried about that. Theorists do a very good job with what they do, and I'm sure they would enjoy the challenge. The last, too far, sonata that I'll talk about uses, I need to double check the title. It's called the Thracian scale, B flat Thracian. You'll notice all of these are named after kind of Greek, Central Asian kind of areas. That was something that Dr. LaFollett chose to kind of help tie it into our more tradition, this modal tradition of naming them after Greek places. I'm a little bit surprised that he found 460 of them or whatever, but that's kind of an impressive feat in itself, I think. So the Thracian scale, I'm going to hop back over to my modes so that you can hear it, because it's very close, but not quite the same. So we have a whole step, whole step, whole step. So again, that kind of whole tone feel. Half step, whole step, half step, whole step. And it sounds like this. Okay, so if I play it right next to the Limnian scale, you can maybe hear the color difference. Okay, so kind of adjacent. I think they're from slightly different, they're in different rows. Yes, they're in different rows, so they have a different arrangement of whole and half steps is what's going on there. As far as the piece is concerned, again, one day I'll get maybe a keyboardist who will tell me all the things that I shouldn't have done. I was basically looking at more of the same ideas, but starting to think a little bit more chordally, vertically instead of horizontally. I don't think there's anything else. I mean, there's still more borrowed chords that you'll start to see or hear, and a lot of accidentals. That's one of the things that you'll want to get really used to if you start tinkering with these modes is accidentals all over the place. Depending on time, if we get to my choral piece, one of the things I talked with Lisa about it was trying to figure out the best accidentals to use to help singers. And it is a challenge figuring out how to spell things for readability. This one was based less on Scarlatti and more on Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1, the B-flat major prelude. There we go. So get a, thank you, a little finger workout. It was also in this particular sonata that I started feeling more comfortable moving to other scales. To be perfectly honest, I forgot that I was going to do this until Liz emailed me last week. This presentation, I mean. And so I hadn't gotten all of my notes together to be absolutely sure which scales I had modulated to. But this is in a different scale space. I just forget exactly which one. I'd have to crack it apart and double check. So I was pretty pleased with how those all turned out. And I set them down to do some other projects, but eventually returned because they are, I don't know, I think these are really neat scales. So when I came back to them, I wanted to do a slightly different stylistic approach, basing the sort of style and, sorry, let me pull it up, here we go. Basing the style more on kind of romantic, either Liszt or Chopin sort of preludes. I think you'll hear that the practice, though, with those 4 short pieces really paid dividends in terms of how this prelude turned out. Again, we're in the Limnian scale, so we looked at that centered on D, centered on G, now centering it on F. And I did have a goal in mind with this one to do an actual like modulation from one key into another, and not just from one, like say, you know, Beethoven would modulate from D major to A major, right? Or something like that. I wanted to modulate from one scale type to a completely different scale type, not just centered on a different pitch. And you'll hear when we get to this area, there's a very dramatic color change that happens when you've shifted to a very different modal structure. So here we go. Um, so in this one, I also started using a lot more extended tertian harmonies, and you get some pretty interesting ones because, again, the bass triads are often either like diminished fifths or augmented chords. And so you end up with a lot of kind of unusual combinations of sevenths that happen with those in these scales. I was also, I'd have to kind of seek it out, which I'm not going to do in front of you, but the concept of modulating with these modes is basically exactly the same as modulating from one major scale to a minor scale, right? You have a certain progression that you kind of set up as your expected baseline. And then you take that progression again and you kind of twist some things to change the direction of the harmonic flow into the scale that you want. You find some common tones, some common chords to help draw you into the next place. The extra challenge is, because there's so many of these modes, I had to be like super clear, okay, I'm modulating to this, right? And not be distracted. And then I put all of my chords together. What chords do they have in common that I can use to draw myself, like to tie them together? What chords and tones do they have that are dissimilar that I need to find a way to bridge, right? And start introducing those different chord tones to bring me into the new scale type. I think that if I hadn't have done that, I would have been just like floundering around and just getting totally lost and directionless. So that's, I think, maybe useful tip. Know where you're starting, know where you're going, and really explore what makes them similar and different so that you can figure out how to tie them together fluidly. Let me kind of stop. I see Liz has a hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious. I can hear when you say that you patterned your first few illustrations after Scarlatti. I could hear it when you patterned after Bach. This sounds more maybe Lisztian, but more Debussy. How did you do that? How did you relate them? For instance, the Scarlatti. Did you? I can almost hear certain Scarlatti pieces of the beat and the Bach. I could hear the Bach, the B flat.
Yeah.
Point.
I think for the first sonatas that I showed you, I tried as much as possible to write it as if it were a continuo and have like a linear bass line, and then thinking of, okay, this is like the continuo part, doing all of the, 6 chords and 6/4 chords and things like that, thinking in those terms and building up more from the bass. For the one that I just played, I think a lot of the Debussy sound is coming from the extended harmonies, a lot of the sevenths and ninths. And also I felt, again, by this point, a lot more comfortable maneuvering around with these pitches. So I felt like I could sort of, unbutton my coat, a little bit, and be a little bit looser with how I used the musical figurations, which I know Debussy tends to, like, especially in his later works. He's just like, we're here, now we're over there, right? I wouldn't say I'm that advanced with it, but as actually thinking about it while listening, I was like, maybe this sounds more like Scriabin or something than Chopin. But also I started thinking much more in terms of, here are these chords, and I'm going to use chords instead of thinking of building from a bass line and having the melody over the bass line. I think is where a lot of that more stylistic difference is coming from, probably. Yes.
Yeah. How long did it take you to get used to the colors, you know, and each of these these new modes to you, that because the pieces feel really accomplished. And I was wondering, you know, did it come quickly to you? I mean, how, you know, what the nudge here and there, or did it take a while?
So I think, honestly, I was working just purely with exercises and writing out chord charts for like a few months, just to play around with them and get used to what kinds of sonorities would happen. And again, I limited myself almost entirely to building triads for most of these. But when I was talking with Dr. LaFollett, we were going over, sometimes you get very different things if you build in fourths or fifths, quartal and quintal harmonies. And I haven't gotten into that quite so much. So there's a lot of possibilities for how you stack all of these pitches. Yeah, it took a while, just sort of playing around. But once I set myself to composing them, this actually ties in with Amara's question. For me, the way I work is I tend to have a lot of prep work, and then the composing just sort of, I just let it take care of itself. And I don't think too much about the theoretical aspect, unless there's a little, you know, it happens pretty frequently. I'm sure you all know, you hit a little musical puzzle, right? Where it's like, okay, I've got this bit and I've got this bit, and there's something in between, right? And then it's like, okay, break out some of the theory tools to try and figure out how to connect them, right? In terms of the chords that I was using for this last prelude that I played for you, I really, how do I put it? I was thinking of two different kind of elements. One is like big stacks of chord notes that are arpeggiated out. And for those, I was thinking, okay, we've got more sort of like a 1-4-5 sort of association, or maybe going in thirds, cycles of thirds in the bass line. And then I would think about, okay, do I want to play around with inversions to kind of change the vertical space that happens over that bass line? Yeah, that's more how I would think about the chord progressions. But then there are other elements where it would kind of pare down to just like a couple of voices. And in things like that, I'm thinking of like harmonizing. How do I harmonize? And or what are the core elements of the harmonization between these voices? And then how can I decorate in between those core elements? Is kind of how I was thinking of them. And again, it was a lot of, I'm just going to I like this particular figuration, so I'm just going to follow it and let the scale do what it does. And if it turns out that I don't like what it does, then more likely there's something wrong with my part writing than the scale itself, right? And there were a couple of parts in there where I had to kind of redo some of the two-voice counterpoint and then redo the figuration from there. So hopefully that kind of answers some of your question. There were, oh
cool
yeah,
that,
sorry, go ahead.
It's cool that these modes are workable in kind of a standard way, you know. It sounds, yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, that was my big question was, do these work in a way I'm already familiar with? And if the answer is no, then I need to talk to somebody about what would work. And actually, I think the next piece will start to get into, well, maybe just building in thirds isn't going to cut it anymore. So let me pull up my mode sheet. The next prelude that I'll show you, again, these are all piano works for now. I have one choral work that I can show you. I started to use, let's see, Parenthian is pretty far down in the scale sheet. It is number 372, and Herbasian is number 389. When you look at this mode, you can already see we're a long, long ways away from our more familiar kind of Dorian, Ionian, Aeolian modes. In particular, we have these augmented steps. And we have, in this case, triply augmented steps as well. Again, in terms of our ears, we wouldn't even necessarily think of these as being steps at all. Although in the structure of the scale, obviously they are. So there's some of that little like apparent disjunction between the theory and the audibility, and just getting used to, okay, that's a step now, right? Instead of just whole and half steps. So this one I didn't actually build chord charts for, but I think you'll be able to maybe start to hear kind of why. There we go. Right, so you have these, a couple of spots where the half steps are just crushed together, and then a big leap, and then another clump of half steps. And the Herbasian scale behaves sort of similarly, or is structured similarly. So I could totally decide to build these in thirds, but I don't think, I mean, they would be recognizable to our ears as thirds. So when I looked at these scales, I deliberately chose some from the very end of the packet to see, all right, what do these do? And the answer is they are very idiosyncratic as you go down. And instead of thinking more harmonically, I decided to go more motivically with this one. Where are these? And if ever I have labeled a mode incorrectly, by all means, correct me. But this one was thought of as like a companion piece. I was thinking of like the Chopin nocturnes. So a companion piece to the prelude I played earlier. If the first one was a dream, I was like, well, what about nightmares? And this is the result. Just make sure everything's okay. Yes. Don't ask me how I wrote this one. I don't remember. Again, for any keyboardists out there, if you're looking at me like, okay, maybe not, that's fine. It was more of a proof of concept idea. And if it actually happens to be playable, then I would be totally happy to see it played. Yeah, so again, thinking of motives and starting to leverage some of that, those counterpoint exercises and bringing that about. I guess I have time for the one last one. I wrote a choral work as well. This one I think I'll just play. I did go over it with Lisa here, and she was very helpful. I can't remember, I don't think I'd been able to work in everything that we talked about in terms of changing accidentals and things of that sort. But in this case, I wanted to be very, very conscious about what it would mean to sing through these modes. And in particular, because a lot of the chords that grow from them are a little bit out of our usual kind of tonal palette. So I wanted to be very careful and judicious in ways that I'm not with the keyboard to be like, okay, if I had to sing this, what would I have to do? And so I tried to move things very linearly and step by step. And I tried to bear in mind all of the things that counterpoint exists to help you with, which is how do you prepare the voice for dissonances so that you can sing them in tune? How do dissonances resolve? And how do you prepare vocal leaps and things of that sort? I tried to be very cognizant of those issues. And I wanted to see how that would change the writing. So this one is based on a Basho haiku. To what shall I compare this life? And the way a boat leaves morning harbor, leaves no trace in the sea. The way a boat leaves the morning harbor, leaves no trace in the sea. So here we go. Last one for tonight. Thank you. Yeah, so I've literally only barely scratched the surface on these modes. As I mentioned, there's 462 of them. And there's a lot of, it's sort of like looking at a gradient palette where it's a little bit hard to tell where one color ends and the next begins. But there's still, you know, every mode has its own little quirky thing about it, and there's a lot to play around with. Hopefully this gets your creative juices flowing. If you want the catalog, I think you'll have to ask Alex. He has it somewhere. Is it on your website? I can't remember. Okay, he'll attach it for those who want to play around with it. And I guess before I sign off or open the door to questions again, I just want to plug my own YouTube channel. I've been doing, music theory, music analysis videos, taking just a phrase and breaking it apart and seeing what makes it tick, what was put together, how it was put together, and also trying to compose little pieces based on what I find in them. It'll also be where I post any of my other compositions as they show up. So yeah, any questions? Yeah, Paul.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for the presentation. It's great. I really enjoyed the pieces and, you know, the whole concept. I was just curious, in the last couple pieces, especially, I guess the elements of color and texture, that kind of world, rather than motivic and such, tended to play more of an important role, perhaps. Have you, or I was curious if you've already composed some pieces or would kind of hope to or interested in where that really might be. I mean, don't know how you predict what a piece is going to be like and what the modus operandi is going to be, but where that's really more the focal point is using these modes or some of them in really focusing on color, perhaps more so than the other elements.
Yeah, it's definitely crossed my mind. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for it to kind of create some interesting structures to kind of underpin colors. I think that's one of the really interesting things as I wrote these pieces was like these were progressions and again, colors that I was just like, would I even have thought of these if I didn't have the scales as like a framework to work within and kind of grow out of? And I was like, no, probably not, right? So whether I'll go in that particular stylistic direction or not in the future, maybe. Right now I've got a bunch of other things kind of bumping around in my head, but there's definitely the opportunity for that kind of compositional approach. And I think the colors can be very striking when you build from these modes. Yeah, Liz.
I can hear, as you were explaining to Kevin how you were going to run the process. Sorry, my voice is not stable. I hear that you are comfortable with each one of these pieces. You're comfortable with the modes and where they're going and what to do with them. It's nice. I find them very nice to listen to, because you feel so free in whatever mode you're in. It's just like if we were doing something tonal and we just know what comes next and when to do a sequence, when to do an inversion and so on. So it's, you've obviously done a few hundred hours work on just getting familiar with each one of them. And Alex, I remember your presentation from last year too. Thanks for this contribution. My God, it's wonderful.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that there was a lot of information on the packet that I didn't go over, not because it's not useful, but because it didn't stick in my head. I think that's more questions for Alex, what all the numbers mean. And I think that if you are wanting to really be comfortable moving around all of the modes and try and finding modes that might relate more or less closely to the one you started with, that's the sense that I get, is a lot of those numbers help you find which ones are more closely kind of allied with the ones that you've got and which ones are more disparate, is kind of the sense that I was getting from our discussions. But it's been a good while since we last talked about it, so I just didn't feel comfortable like going into, oh, here's what these numbers can be used for. So yeah. Oh, Kevin, I think you're muted there. All right.
I tried using the space bar, silly me.
Oh.
I remember that Dr. LaFollett in that particular talk that he gave, that there was some numbers that suggested, I can't remember exactly how it was put, but easier on the ear or somehow more natural. I remember Lydian scored the lowest. It was somehow more accessible. And I was going like, yeah, yeah. And then he went up the scale, or it was down the scale. Now I can't remember, but the other end of the scale were these, more gnarly, less familiar worlds, I was just curious to see where the ones you chose fit in that scale. So I'll look that up.
Oh, sure. Yeah. When I started, I actually deliberately chose scales that were closest to the top, because I was like, well, it's likely they will be somewhat familiar. And in fact, I think that Limnian scale is the one, I think Howard Hansen uses it a good amount, if I remember right. There was one of them we talked about, like the Hansen scale, that he used quite frequently. Yeah, the S and E value. Yeah, so the numbers there are additional tools that help you navigate, I think, is the best way to put it. And I think Alex is also working on eventually working on a program that, like an app or something, that will allow you to visualize these modes a little bit better. So yeah, he's put a huge amount of work into this already. I can only imagine what all went into it. So I'm real grateful that it exists as a foundation for future music making. Yeah, Lisa.
Are you writing music for strings with these?
I did write some solo cello. Oh, thank you, Alex. I did write some solo cello works, actually. That maybe I could play one if I can find it in my channel. Maybe that's a little bit too weird. I know I posted them. They are not immediately accessible, maybe. Okay, I can't find them right now. I might have to repost them on my YouTube channel because I don't see them. But
cool.
yes, I have written some unaccompanied cello works using them. I think Alex has a string trio. He has a lot, actually, a number of works that are quite delightful. And he has a very different approach to using them. It'd be a good compare and contrast exercise, right? To kind of see two different composers approaching these scales. Yeah, Paul.
I was just wondering if prior to your work with these, consciously with this collection, did you ever notice any patterns in your own composition before that that kind of gravitated towards a particular mode or modes, like just sort of like a natural kind of habit, or just something you're like, oh, actually maybe that might be my favorite one, or
Well, I think in general I'd been attracted to modes for a long time. I can plug my scale book because my my
that was
scale
a good
method,
segue, wasn't it?
yeah, my scale method for cello, and I'm working out the violin and viola books. Actually, my big book of Boredom and Tears uses the 7 modes as a starting place for helping teach students the beginning steps of finding pitches on the instrument, on the string instrument. So that had been in my head for a very long time already.
Yeah.
I do have a particular fondness for the Lydian inflected scale, that sharp 4.
So, like Lydian dominant, or
like that Lydian dominant scale, I think is another term for the scale that I used kind of frequently.
Yeah.
In these pieces.
I've noticed that about myself. At a certain point, I was like, wait a second. I've always used this thing forever and ever, like naturally, like kind of without thinking about it. But it's a real kind of, to me, a real primordial kind of scale, and it's sort of based on the harmonic series and whatever. So, anyway, I was just curious. Sorry?
Melodic minor.
Melodic minor, right? That makes sense too. Yeah, and you're a jazzer too.
I mean, the Lydian. Yeah, I know. I was going to say,
but they're both
the jazz territory.
Well, but they're
but it's the mode of the melodic minor, or I don't know what Alex calls it.
Yeah, the Thracian. That was the one I think I was thinking of. I thought I had used it, but I didn't. So 16 other names. Yes.
I find myself. I don't really have a. I don't know if I have a question around this, but I find myself with the modes thinking intervallically. And so sometimes it's hard for me to separate the modes out. It's just the relationships between the different notes that are same across the modes of any one class. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that was something in one of the preludes where, or in one of the sonatas, the second sonata had a bunch of scales over triads, basically. And yeah, they slip fairly easily from one mode in the row to the next, in the same way that you might find in jazz. So that's something to tinker around with as well. It's kind of that intervallic content that you're talking about. Anything else? Looks like everybody is satisfied. All right.
Thank you for a great presentation, and thanks again, Alex. I remember the presentation from last year too.
Of course. Yeah, this wouldn't have happened without him. So big round of applause to him and his work. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Lisa.
Nice to see you.
How's everybody doing?
Yeah, good.
Everybody hanging in there?
Adam.
Hey, it's week 2 of January, and we already broke America.
Where do you begin?
Well,
Wow, these days are very full. It's about time, Joan. How are you, Paul?
Boring as hell. Just hunker down in my house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, just
Yeah.
feel really fortunate, and in a lot of different ways.
Yes. Yes.
A lot of strife out there.
yeah,
Sure.
for sure.
Oh, another good presentation. Thanks for putting it on, Liz. And
Thanks, Liz.
All of you for,
Yeah,
we couldn't do it without all of you. Well, I'm gonna sign.
well, yeah, it's getting late.
yeah.
Good
Good
night,
night.
everybody.
Good night, everybody.
All right, thanks,
Good to see you
everybody.
all.
Good
Take
seeing
good
you
care.
all.
Stay safe. Thanks, Adam.
Bye-bye.
Hey, Ted, did I miss anything horrific at the end of the board meeting? I had to leave early.